In 1852, the Richmond Medical Institute welcomed its most promising class of obstetric students. 3 weeks later, 17 sets of triplets had vanished without explanation. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones of Marshall Street as Dr. James Franklin unlocked the doors to what Richmond's elite considered the finest medical training facility south of Philadelphia. Inside those Gothic revival walls, beneath the reverent silence of lecture halls where future physicians learned to heal, something far more sinister was taking root. The Richmond Medical Institute had built its reputation on scientific advancement and moral rectitude, but in the winter of 1852, its obstetric wing would become the epicenter of a mystery so disturbing that even today, Virginia's medical archives remain deliberately incomplete. What began as a celebration of medical progress would end with empty cradles, falsified records, and questions that neither science nor law could answer. The Richmond Medical Institute stood as a monument to Southern medical excellence, its imposing brick facade commanding respect from all who passed along Marshall Street. Founded in 1838 by Dr. Edward Collins, a Harvard-trained physician who had returned to Virginia with revolutionary ideas about medical education, the institute had quickly established itself as the premier destination for aspiring doctors throughout the Confederate States. Dr. Collins believed that Southern medicine needed to rival its northern counterparts, and his vision had transformed a modest collection of rented rooms into a sprawling complex that housed lecture halls, laboratories, and the crown jewel of the institution, the obstetric wing. The obstetric department, established in 1845, represented everything the Richmond Medical Institute aspired to be. Under the direction of Dr. James Franklin, a soft-spoken man whose gentle demeanor masked a brilliant analytical mind, the department had become renowned for its innovative approach to childbirth and infant care. Dr. Franklin had studied in Edinburgh, where he had witnessed the latest advances in obstetric science, and he returned to Richmond determined to bring these techniques to Virginia's medical community. His lectures drew students from as far away as South Carolina and Tennessee, all eager to learn from a man who had personally delivered over 300 babies without losing a single mother to childbed fever. The Institute's reputation extended far beyond medical circles. Richmond's most prominent families entrusted their daughters to Dr. Franklin's care, confident that his expertise would ensure safe deliveries and healthy children. The Virginia Medical Society had awarded the Institute its highest honor in 1849, recognizing its contributions to medical education and patient care. Local newspapers regularly featured articles about the Institute's achievements, and visiting physicians from northern cities often toured the facilities, taking notes on the advanced techniques being taught to Southern medical students. By 1852, the Richmond Medical Institute had produced 127 practicing physicians, many of whom had established successful practices throughout Virginia and beyond. The obstetric wing alone had overseen more than 800 births, maintaining detailed records of each delivery in leather-bound journals that filled an entire wall of Dr. Franklin's office. These records, meticulously documented with observations about maternal health, infant development, and post-delivery complications, represented one of the most comprehensive medical databases in the American South. The Institute's physical expansion reflected its growing influence. The original building had been supplemented with 2 additional wings, including specialized facilities for surgical instruction and a library that housed the largest collection of medical texts south of Baltimore. The obstetric wing occupied the eastern section of the complex, its windows carefully positioned to capture the morning light that Dr. Franklin believed essential for proper examination of newborns. The delivery rooms were equipped with the latest medical instruments, including forceps designed by Dr. Franklin himself and birthing chairs that had been specially crafted by Richmond's finest furniture makers. Students who attended the Richmond Medical Institute came from families that could afford the substantial tuition fees, ensuring that the institution attracted young men of good breeding and moral character. The application process required letters of recommendation from established physicians, local ministers, and community leaders, creating a student body that reflected the social elite of Virginia society. These young men lived in boarding houses near the institute, where they formed lifelong friendships and professional networks that would serve them throughout their careers. The curriculum at the Richmond Medical Institute was rigorous and comprehensive, requiring 3 years of study followed by a year of practical experience under the supervision of established physicians. Students attended lectures 6 days a week, participated in laboratory exercises, and observed actual medical procedures in the institute's treatment rooms. The obstetric program was particularly demanding, requiring students to assist with at least 50 births before they could receive their certification. This hands-on experience was considered essential preparation for the responsibilities they would face as practicing physicians. Dr. Collins maintained strict standards for both students and faculty, believing that the institute's reputation depended on the moral character of its members. Students were required to sign a code of conduct that prohibited gambling, excessive drinking, and other behaviors that might reflect poorly on the institution. Faculty members underwent regular evaluations, and any hint of impropriety could result in immediate dismissal. These policies had helped the institute avoid the scandals that had plagued other medical schools throughout the South. The obstetric wing's success had attracted attention from medical professionals throughout the region. Dr. Franklin regularly corresponded with colleagues in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, sharing his observations about maternal health and infant development. His papers had been published in several medical journals, and he was frequently invited to speak at medical conferences. This scholarly activity enhanced the institute's reputation and attracted visiting physicians who came to Richmond specifically to observe Dr. Franklin's techniques. The winter of 1852 brought a new class of medical students to the Richmond Medical Institute, including 12 young men who had been accepted into the obstetric program. Among them was Charles Baker, the son of a prominent Norfolk physician, George Mitchell, whose family owned extensive tobacco plantations in Henrico County, and Joseph Carter, a quiet young man from Alexandria, whose letters of recommendation had particularly impressed Dr. Franklin. These students represented the future of Virginia medicine, carefully selected for their intellectual ability and moral character. The institute's reputation for excellence seemed unassailable as the new academic year began. Local newspapers had published favorable articles about the incoming class, and several prominent families had already requested that their daughters be attended by Dr. Franklin's students when their time came. The Institute's Board of Trustees, composed of Richmond's most influential citizens, had recently approved funding for additional expansion, including a new wing dedicated to pediatric medicine. Everything suggested that the institution would continue its trajectory toward national recognition. However, beneath the veneer of medical respectability, subtle changes were beginning to emerge in the obstetric wing. Dr. Franklin had begun implementing new experimental procedures that he claimed would revolutionize the understanding of infant development. These procedures, he explained to his students, were based on the latest European research and would position the Richmond Medical Institute at the forefront of medical science. The students, eager to participate in groundbreaking research, embraced these innovations without question, unaware that they were about to become complicit in practices that would challenge every principle of medical ethics they had been taught to uphold. The first indication that something was amiss came from an unexpected source, the Institute's laundry service. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, a widow who had been washing linens for the medical facility for nearly 8 years, noticed a disturbing pattern in the materials she received from the obstetric wing. The usual blood-stained sheets and towels from deliveries had been supplemented by items that seemed inconsistent with normal birthing procedures. Small blankets bore stains that Mrs. Hughes couldn't identify, and she occasionally found what appeared to be tiny restraints among the linens, leather straps barely 6 inches long with brass buckles that seemed designed for impossibly small limbs. When Mrs. Hughes mentioned her concerns to Dr. Franklin during one of his routine inspections of the laundry facilities, he dismissed her observations with the explanation that the obstetric wing was conducting research into premature infant care. The restraints, he explained, were specialized devices designed to prevent premature babies from injuring themselves during their earliest days of life. Mrs. Hughes accepted this explanation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about Dr. Franklin's demeanor had changed. The gentle physician who had always taken time to inquire about her children and grandchildren seemed distant and preoccupied, as if his mind was focused on matters that weighed heavily on his conscience. The medical students in the obstetric program began to notice changes in their routine as well. Charles Baker, whose father had specifically requested that he study under Dr. Franklin, found himself increasingly troubled by certain aspects of the training he was receiving. The standard curriculum had been supplemented with what Dr. Franklin called advanced observational techniques, which involved detailed documentation of infant behavior during the first hours after birth. Students were required to record precise measurements of newborn responses to various stimuli, including reactions to light, sound, and physical contact. These observations, Dr. Franklin explained, were essential for understanding the development of human consciousness and would contribute to revolutionary advances in pediatric medicine. However, the nature of these observations troubled several students. George Mitchell confided to his roommate that he had witnessed procedures that seemed unnecessarily intrusive for newborns who appeared to be in perfect health. During one particularly disturbing session, he had watched Dr. Franklin perform what appeared to be neurological tests on triplets who had been born just hours earlier. The tests involved the application of mild electrical stimulation to various parts of the infants' bodies, while students recorded their responses. Dr. Franklin insisted that these procedures were painless and would provide invaluable data about infant development, but Mitchell couldn't ignore the distressed cries of the babies during the examinations. The parents of these infants were told that their children were receiving the finest medical care available, and they were encouraged to leave the babies in the institute's care for extended periods to ensure proper monitoring. Dr. Franklin explained that the first weeks of life were crucial for infant development, and the specialized environment of the obstetric wing would provide optimal conditions for healthy growth. Most parents, overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for newborns and impressed by the Institute's reputation, gratefully accepted these arrangements. Joseph Carter, the quiet student from Alexandria, began to notice discrepancies in the records he was required to maintain. The number of births documented in the daily logs didn't always match the number of infants he observed in the obstetric wing. When he mentioned these inconsistencies to Dr. Franklin, he was told that some infants had been transferred to other facilities for specialized care. However, Carter noticed that these transfers weren't documented in the official records, and he couldn't find any correspondence with other medical institutions that might have received these patients. The situation became more troubling when Carter attempted to verify information about several sets of triplets who had been born during the previous month. According to the delivery records, 5 sets of triplets had been born in the obstetric wing during January 1852, but Carter could only account for 11 infants in the nursery facilities. When he discreetly inquired about the missing babies, he was told that they had been reunited with their families after receiving specialized treatment. However, Carter had been present during most of these deliveries, and he couldn't recall any of the parents taking their children home. The nursing staff in the obstetric wing began to exhibit signs of strain that couldn't be attributed to normal work-related stress. Margaret Wells, the head nurse who had worked with Dr. Franklin for nearly 7 years, seemed increasingly anxious and withdrawn. She had always been known for her cheerful demeanor and genuine affection for the newborns in her care, but colleagues noticed that she had become reluctant to discuss specific cases and seemed to avoid certain areas of the obstetric wing. When questioned about her changed behavior, she claimed that the demanding nature of the new research protocols was simply more exhausting than her previous duties. Ruth Palmer, a younger nurse who had joined the staff in 1851, confided to her sister that she had witnessed procedures that she couldn't understand or explain. She described seeing Dr. Franklin and his advanced students conducting examinations that seemed to continue for hours, with infants being subjected to tests that went far beyond anything she had learned during her training. Palmer mentioned that she had been instructed to prepare special solutions and medications that weren't listed in any of the standard medical texts, and she had observed the use of instruments that seemed designed for purposes she couldn't identify. The local community began to notice subtle changes in the families who had given birth at the Richmond Medical Institute. Several women who had delivered healthy infants reported that their children seemed different after spending their first weeks in the obstetric wing. These mothers described babies who appeared unusually passive, with diminished responses to stimuli and developmental delays that became apparent as the children grew older. Dr. Franklin assured concerned parents that these variations were within the normal range of infant development, but the pattern of similar symptoms among children who had been born at the institute was beginning to attract attention. Elizabeth Dixon, whose triplets had been born at the institute in December 1851, became particularly vocal about her concerns. Her 3 sons had been described as healthy and robust at birth, but after spending 4 weeks in the obstetric wing's specialized care, they exhibited behaviors that troubled her. The children seemed unusually quiet and failed to respond to their mother's voice in the manner she expected. When she expressed these concerns to Dr. Franklin, he suggested that her expectations might be unrealistic and that the children would develop normally with time. However, Mrs. Dixon noticed that other mothers who had given birth at the institute reported similar observations about their children. The medical students themselves began to experience psychological effects from their involvement in the obstetric program. Several reported difficulty sleeping, with dreams that featured the cries of infants and images of the procedures they had witnessed. Charles Baker confided to his family physician that he was beginning to question whether he was suited for a career in medicine, despite his previous enthusiasm for the profession. The psychological burden of participating in procedures that seemed to cause distress to newborns was taking a toll on young men who had entered the program with genuine desires to help others. The Institute's administration seemed oblivious to these concerns, or perhaps they chose to ignore them. Dr. Collins continued to promote the obstetric program as a model of medical excellence, and the Board of Trustees approved additional funding for research activities. The Virginia Medical Society scheduled a visit to the Institute for the spring of 1852, planning to use the obstetric wing as an example of progressive medical education. Local newspapers continued to publish favorable articles about the Institute's achievements, apparently unaware of the growing unease among students, staff, and parents. However, the signs of trouble were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The number of requests for medical records from parents who had given birth at the Institute was growing, and several families were seeking second opinions about their children's development from physicians outside the Richmond medical community. Dr. Franklin responded to these inquiries by emphasizing the confidential nature of medical research and the importance of maintaining the integrity of ongoing studies. He assured concerned parents that their children were contributing to advances in medical science that would benefit future generations. The winter of 1852 was drawing to a close, and the atmosphere in the obstetric wing had become increasingly tense. Students whispered among themselves about procedures they had witnessed. Nurses appeared anxious and distracted, and parents were beginning to ask questions that couldn't be easily answered. The reputation of the Richmond Medical Institute remained intact in the broader community, but those who worked within its walls were beginning to realize that something deeply troubling was taking place in the institution they had once revered. The truth began to emerge on a cold February morning when Joseph Carter arrived early at the institute to complete his required documentation. As he entered the obstetric wing through a side door that was typically locked during evening hours, he discovered it had been left open by maintenance staff who had been working overnight. Carter decided to use this opportunity to review some patient records that had been troubling him, particularly those involving the triplets, whose disappearances he had been unable to explain. In Dr. Franklin's office, Carter found files that weren't stored in the usual location. Hidden behind the impressive collection of medical journals was a locked cabinet that had been left open, revealing records that documented procedures he had never seen described in any medical text. The files contain detailed observations of experiments conducted on newborn triplets, including measurements of their responses to various forms of stimulation that went far beyond anything that could be justified for medical research. The documentation was meticulous, with charts tracking the effects of different substances administered to infants and precise recordings of their physiological responses. Carter's hands trembled as he read descriptions of procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics he had been taught. Dr. Franklin's notes described efforts to study the development of human consciousness by subjecting newborn triplets to controlled trauma designed to measure their capacity for memory formation. The experiments were based on a theory that triplets, sharing similar genetic material, would provide ideal subjects for comparative studies of human psychological development. Dr. Franklin had convinced himself that these procedures were scientifically valuable, even though they involved deliberate infliction of pain on defenseless infants. The files revealed that 17 sets of triplets had been born at the Richmond Medical Institute during the previous 6 months, but only 6 sets had been returned to their families. The remaining 11 sets had been subjected to increasingly invasive procedures that Dr. Franklin believed would unlock the secrets of human consciousness. The experiments had been conducted with the assistance of advanced medical students who had been told they were participating in groundbreaking research that would revolutionize the understanding of infant development. Carter discovered detailed records of procedures that had been performed on triplets who had been separated from their families under the pretext of requiring specialized medical care. Dr. Franklin had developed a system of graduated experiments designed to test the limits of infant resilience and the development of early memory. The procedures began with relatively mild stimuli, but progressed to interventions that caused obvious distress to the subjects. The documentation included photographs of the infants during various stages of experimentation, images that Carter found so disturbing that he was forced to step outside the office to compose himself. The records revealed that Dr. Franklin had been corresponding with physicians in European medical centers who were conducting similar research. The letters, written in a mixture of medical terminology and coded language, described the exchange of information about experimental techniques and the sharing of results from procedures that would have been considered criminal if their true nature had been understood by the broader medical community. Dr. Franklin had convinced himself that he was contributing to advances in medical science that would ultimately benefit humanity, even though his methods violated every ethical principle of medical practice. Carter's investigation revealed that several of the medical students had begun to question the procedures they were witnessing, but their concerns had been dismissed by Dr. Franklin as evidence of insufficient commitment to scientific progress. Students who expressed doubts about the ethics of the experiments were told that they lacked the intellectual sophistication necessary for advanced medical research. Those who persisted in their objections were quietly transferred to other programs within the institute, their concerns forgotten once they were removed from the obstetric wing. The most disturbing discovery came when Carter found records documenting the ultimate fate of the experimental subjects. The triplets who had been subjected to the most intensive procedures had not survived the experience, their deaths recorded in clinical language that obscured the true cause of their demise. Dr. Franklin had attributed these deaths to complications arising from premature birth or genetic defects, but the detailed records revealed that the infants had died as a direct result of the procedures to which they had been subjected. The bodies had been disposed of through arrangements with a local mortuary, the deaths never reported to the families who believed their children were receiving specialized medical care. Carter realized that he had uncovered evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical research. The respected physician who had been his mentor and inspiration had been conducting experiments that resulted in the deaths of infants who had been entrusted to his care. The triplets had been selected as subjects because their families were less likely to question extended periods of medical observation, and because Dr. Franklin believed that their shared genetic material would provide more reliable experimental data. The psychological impact of these discoveries was overwhelming for Carter, who had entered the medical profession with genuine desires to help others. He found himself questioning everything he had learned during his time at the Institute, wondering whether other respected physicians were capable of similar atrocities. The realization that he had been an unwitting participant in procedures that had resulted in the deaths of innocent infants filled him with a sense of guilt and responsibility that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Carter's investigation revealed that the nursing staff had been aware of the true nature of the procedures, but had been intimidated into silence through a combination of professional pressure and financial incentives. Margaret Wells, the head nurse, had been receiving supplemental payments in exchange for her cooperation, and she had been assured that the research would eventually lead to advances in infant care that would save lives. The younger nurses had been told that their concerns about the procedures demonstrated their inexperience and lack of understanding of advanced medical techniques. The records also revealed that Dr. Franklin had been documenting his experiments with the intention of publishing his findings in medical journals, believing that his research would establish his reputation as a pioneering scientist. He had been preparing a comprehensive report that would describe his theories about infant consciousness and present his experimental data as evidence of groundbreaking discoveries in the field of pediatric medicine. The report would have been submitted to prestigious medical journals in Europe and America, potentially inspiring other physicians to conduct similar experiments. Carter found evidence that Dr. Franklin had been planning to expand his research program with proposals for experiments that would have involved even more invasive procedures. The expansion would have required additional funding and facilities, and Dr. Franklin had been preparing grant applications to medical societies and private foundations. The proposals described ambitious research goals that would have resulted in the deaths of dozens of additional infants, all in the name of advancing medical knowledge. The discovery of these records left Carter with an impossible choice. He could report his findings to the authorities, potentially destroying the reputation of the Richmond Medical Institute and ending his own medical career before it had begun. Alternatively, he could remain silent and allow the experiments to continue, knowing that his inaction would result in the deaths of additional infants. The weight of this decision was crushing for a young man who had been raised to respect authority and believe in the fundamental goodness of medical professionals. Carter decided that he could not remain silent about what he had discovered. He began to document his findings, copying the most damning evidence from Dr. Franklin's files and preparing a report that would expose the true nature of the experiments being conducted in the obstetric wing. He knew that his actions would have devastating consequences for everyone involved, but he also knew that he could not live with himself if he allowed the experiments to continue. The revelation of Dr. Franklin's crimes would ultimately expose the dark reality behind the Richmond Medical Institute's reputation for excellence. The institution that had been celebrated as a model of medical education and ethical practice had been concealing systematic murder disguised as scientific research. The triplets who had been subjected to these experiments had died not from natural causes or medical complications, but from deliberate actions taken by physicians who had abandoned their fundamental obligation to protect and heal their patients. Joseph Carter's decision to expose Dr. Franklin's experiments set in motion a series of events that would ultimately demonstrate the power of institutional protection over individual conscience. When Carter presented his evidence to Dr. Edward Collins, the founder and director of the Richmond Medical Institute, he expected to find an ally in his quest for justice. Instead, he discovered that Collins had been aware of the general nature of Franklin's research and had chosen to ignore its implications in order to protect the Institute's reputation. Collins listened to Carter's report with apparent concern, but his response revealed the calculating mind of an administrator who valued institutional survival above ethical considerations. He assured Carter that the matter would be investigated thoroughly, but he also made it clear that any public disclosure of the allegations would destroy the careers of everyone associated with the Institute. Collins suggested that Carter might be mistaken about what he had witnessed, pointing out that medical research often involved procedures that could be misunderstood by those who lacked sufficient experience to interpret them correctly. The investigation that followed was conducted entirely within the confines of the Institute, with no involvement from external authorities or independent medical experts. Collins appointed a committee of senior faculty members to review the evidence, but the committee's composition ensured that the investigation would protect the institution's interests rather than seek the truth. The committee concluded that Dr. Franklin's research had been conducted according to accepted medical practices and that the deaths of the experimental subjects had resulted from natural causes rather than the procedures to which they had been subjected. Dr. Franklin's response to the allegations was to deny any wrongdoing while simultaneously preparing for his departure from the Institute. He destroyed many of his research records, claiming that they contained preliminary observations that would be misleading if taken out of context. The remaining files were locked away in the Institute's archives, where they would remain inaccessible to future researchers or investigators. Franklin announced that he would be taking a position at a medical facility in New Orleans, where he would continue his research under more favorable conditions. The medical students who had participated in the experiments were sworn to secrecy through a combination of threats and incentives. They were told that any disclosure of the research activities would result in their immediate expulsion from the Institute and the destruction of their prospects for medical careers. Several students, including Charles Baker and George Mitchell, were offered positions at prestigious medical facilities in exchange for their silence. The psychological pressure of keeping these secrets would affect these young men for the rest of their lives, with several eventually abandoning medicine entirely. The nursing staff faced similar pressure to maintain silence about what they had witnessed. Margaret Wells was offered a substantial financial settlement in exchange for her agreement never to discuss the procedures she had observed. Ruth Palmer, the younger nurse who had expressed concerns about the experiments, was transferred to a different department within the Institute and was given a significant increase in salary. The other staff members were reminded of their professional obligations and the importance of maintaining confidentiality about all medical procedures. The families of the triplets who had died during the experiments were never informed of the true circumstances of their children's deaths. They continued to believe that their infants had succumbed to natural causes or medical complications, and they were told that the Institute had done everything possible to save their children. Several families expressed gratitude to Dr. Franklin for his efforts, unaware that their children had been murdered in the name of medical research. The broader medical community remained unaware of the crimes that had been committed at the Richmond Medical Institute. The institution's reputation for excellence continued to attract students and patients, and Dr. Franklin's research was never subjected to external review or scrutiny. The Virginia Medical Society proceeded with its planned visit to the Institute, and the obstetric wing was praised as an example of progressive medical education. The Board of Trustees approved additional funding for research activities, apparently satisfied that the Institute was fulfilling its mission of advancing medical knowledge. Joseph Carter found himself isolated and ostracized within the medical community after his attempt to expose the truth. His allegations were dismissed as the product of an overly sensitive temperament, and he was advised to focus on his studies rather than interfering with the work of his superiors. Carter completed his medical training, but he never practiced medicine, choosing instead to work as a clerk in a government office where he could avoid the ethical compromises that seemed inherent in the medical profession. The records of Dr. Franklin's experiments were eventually lost or destroyed, with no official documentation surviving to confirm the extent of his crimes. The Institute's archives were reorganized several times over the following decades, and files related to the obstetric wing's research activities disappeared during these transitions. Later historians who attempted to research the Institute's history found gaps in the documentation that could not be explained by normal record-keeping practices. The children who survived their time in the obstetric wing continued to exhibit the developmental abnormalities that had concerned their parents, but these symptoms were attributed to natural variations in infant development rather than the effects of the procedures to which they had been subjected. Several of these children experienced lifelong psychological and neurological problems that were never connected to their experiences at the Richmond Medical Institute. The surviving triplets, in particular, seemed to share similar patterns of developmental delays and behavioral abnormalities that suggested a common cause. Dr. Franklin's career continued to flourish after his departure from Richmond. He established a successful practice in New Orleans, where he became known for his expertise in obstetric medicine and his contributions to medical research. He published several papers in prestigious medical journals, but none of them referenced the experiments he had conducted in Richmond. Franklin died in 1887, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving no record of the crimes he had committed during his tenure at the Richmond Medical Institute. The Richmond Medical Institute continued to operate for several more decades, maintaining its reputation as a center of medical excellence. The obstetric wing was eventually closed in the 1890s, not because of any scandal or investigation, but because changes in medical education had made its programs obsolete. The building that had housed the wing was converted to other uses, and the facilities where the experiments had been conducted were dismantled and forgotten. The true scope of Dr. Franklin's crimes may never be fully known, but the evidence suggests that at least 33 infants died as a result of his experiments, with the majority being triplets who had been specifically selected for their research value. The families of these children never learned the truth about their deaths, and the medical community never acknowledged the systematic violations of ethical principles that had occurred within one of its most respected institutions. The legacy of the Richmond Medical Institute's obstetric wing serves as a reminder of the potential for institutional corruption to conceal systematic abuse. The respect accorded to medical professionals and the trust placed in educational institutions created conditions that allowed Dr. Franklin to conduct his experiments without meaningful oversight or accountability. The failure of the medical community to investigate